The report said the call never existed. No address, no customer, no order. But my dashcam still had the footage of me standing in front of that house, knocking on a door that shouldn't have been there, while someone inside whispered my name like they already knew how this was supposed to end. I didn't start driving at night because I liked it. I started because my hours at the hardware store got cut, and the bills didn't. At 53, you don't pivot careers. You patch holes and hope nothing leaks at once. Food delivery was quiet, predictable, and mostly invisible. That was exactly what I wanted. The night everything went wrong was a Tuesday. No rain, no fog, no excuses. I remember that because the sky was clear enough to show stars, and I remember thinking how strange it was that a night so calm could still feel thin, like the world had been stretched just a little too tight. My last order was supposed to be simple. 10 minutes out of town. 1 bag. Small tip. The app pinged, I accepted, and the route popped up automatically. That's where the first problem should have been obvious. The address wasn't a street. It was a coordinate. Not unheard of. Sometimes people pinned parks, job sites, warehouses, but this one was tagged as residential. The app didn't seem to care. It drew a line off the main road, past the new subdivisions, and into the darker part of the county where the streetlights stop pretending they're useful. I told myself I'd cancel if it got weird. I didn't cancel. The road narrowed. The houses thinned out. Then they disappeared altogether. After about 15 minutes, my headlights were the only moving things in a world made of trees and fences. The GPS told me to turn onto a gravel road that didn't have a sign. Just a gap in the brush and 2 ruts worn into pale dirt. I slowed, hesitated, then turned anyway. The app still showed a countdown. 2 minutes. 1 minute. The coordinate landed at the end of that road, where a single house waited like it had been left there by mistake. No lights on. No porch lamp. No cars. Just a shape where a home should be. I pulled up and stayed in the car longer than I meant to. The engine ticking. The dash clock glowing 11:47 p.m. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears. I checked the app again. Customer instructions. Front door. Please hurry. That annoyed me more than it should have. I grabbed the bag, locked the car, and walked up the drive. The house looked older up close. Not abandoned, maintained, but barely. The windows were dark. The curtains were drawn. The porch boards creaked under my weight in a way that made me suddenly aware of how loud I was being. I knocked. Nothing. I knocked again, harder. From somewhere inside, I heard movement. Not footsteps. Not exactly. More like something shifting. My phone buzzed in my hand. A message from the customer. You can leave it. I'm right here. I looked at the door. Then I looked at the windows. Then I looked back at the door. I'm at the front, I said out loud to no one. Another message appeared. I know. That's when I noticed the door wasn't fully closed. It was unlatched. Just enough to leave a thin black line where the inside of the house waited. I should have left the food. I should have taken the photo. I should have walked back to my car. Instead, I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Not rot. Not garbage. Dust. Old wood. Cold air that had been sitting still for too long. The entryway was empty. No furniture. No pictures. No shoes by the door. Just bare floor and a hallway that led into darkness. Hello, I called. My voice sounded wrong in there, like the house was too big for it. My phone buzzed again. Just set it down and step inside a little. The camera can't see from there. What camera? I asked before I could stop myself. No reply. I took 1 step in, then another. The door stayed open behind me. I could feel the quiet thickening, pressing. I set the bag down on a small table just inside the hall and took out my phone to take the picture. That's when I heard someone breathe. Not in front of me, behind me, slow, controlled, close enough that I felt it on the back of my neck. I didn't turn around. My phone screen went black. Not dead, not off, just black. And in the dark glass I could see a shape standing where the door had been. Tall, still, watching. A voice came from behind me, so close it felt like it was inside my head. Thank you for coming all this way. I ran. I don't remember dropping the phone. I don't remember grabbing the door. I only remember the sound of my own breathing turning into something ugly and animal as I bolted for the car. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. When I finally pulled over, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The app showed the order as delivered. The customer was gone. The address was gone. The entire trip history was gone. The next morning, I went to the police. That's when they told me the call never existed. No address, no customer, no order, just my word. And one piece of dashcam footage of me standing in front of a dark house, knocking on a door that their system insists has never been there. The sheriff told me the woman had been reported missing for 3 years, and that was strange, because I had just watched her porch light turn off while I was still standing in her driveway with her groceries in my hands. I wasn't even supposed to be in that part of the county that night because my route had ended 20 miles back, and the app had already tried to send me home, but then another order slipped in like it had been waiting for me specifically, and the name on it was just Evelyn, with no last name, no profile picture, and an address that looked normal until you realized the street number repeated twice, like someone had typed it in without thinking about whether it existed. I remember accepting it because the pay was good and because I was tired enough to stop arguing with small red flags, and I remember thinking I'd drop it off and be back on the highway before midnight, and I remember the way the GPS kept recalculating even though I wasn't missing any turns, like it couldn't quite agree with itself about where I was supposed to go. The road out there was a long, narrow strip of asphalt that cut through low hills and dead fields, and the farther I drove, the more it felt like the world had quietly thinned out, like someone had erased details to save time. And when the app finally told me to turn, it was onto a road that didn't have a sign, didn't have a shoulder, and didn't look like it had been used much at all. The headlights caught mailboxes with no numbers and fences that leaned like they were tired, and after another mile I saw a house sitting back from the road, not falling apart, not abandoned, just waiting, and I almost missed it because there were no lights on and no car in the drive and nothing about it that said anyone lived there. But the app chimed and told me I'd arrived, and I felt that small, familiar pinch in my stomach that comes right before you tell yourself you're overthinking things. I parked, took the bags, and walked up the gravel path, and every step sounded too loud in the quiet. And when I reached the porch, I noticed there were no footprints in the dust except mine, which should have been the moment I turned around. But instead I knocked and waited, and waited, and waited. And then the porch light came on by itself, and I jumped like I'd been touched. And a woman's voice from somewhere inside said, "Just leave it, please." And it sounded tired, not scared, not angry, just worn down, like she had been using that same tone for a long time. I said I needed to take the photo because that's what the app requires, and she didn't answer. So I set the bags down anyway and lifted my phone. And that's when the front door opened just enough to show me a sliver of a hallway and a woman's face half hidden in shadow. And she looked older than I expected, with gray hair pulled back and eyes that kept flicking past me like she was checking for something, and she said, "You shouldn't be here after dark," in a way that sounded more like a statement than advice. I told her I was just dropping off the order, and she nodded like she already knew that, and then she asked me very calmly if anyone else had been sent before me, and when I said no, she closed her eyes for a second like she was counting something in her head, and then she said, "They're late this time." And that should have made me ask questions, but instead I took the photo, wished her a good night, and started walking back to my car. I was halfway down the path when I heard her call my name, and the problem with that is I had never told her my name, and when I turned around she was standing in the doorway with the light behind her, making her look like a cutout instead of a person, and she said, "If they ask, you were never here." And before I could ask who they were, the light went out and the door closed and the house went back to being a dark shape in a dark field. I drove away feeling like I just stepped out of someone else's story, and for the first few miles I kept checking my mirrors, even though there was no one behind me, and when I finally got back to town and checked the app, the order was gone, not marked completed, not canceled, just not there, like it had never existed, and I told myself that was a glitch and that I was done for the night anyway. The next morning, my phone rang while I was making coffee, and a man introduced himself as a deputy and asked me if I'd made a delivery out to Old Creek Road the night before. And I said yes, because lying didn't even occur to me, and he asked me to describe the house, and I did. And there was a long pause on the line before he said, "That's strange." And when I asked why, he told me there hadn't been a standing house on that property for almost 5 years. He told me it burned down in the winter, and that the owner, a woman named Evelyn Harper, had been inside when it happened, and that they never found her. I laughed because that's what you do when someone tells you something that doesn't fit into your head, and I told him he was mistaken because I just spoken to her, and he didn't laugh back, and he asked me if I was sure about the address, and I said yes, and he said, because we've had a few reports lately. And when I asked reports of what, he said, people saying they've seen lights out there. And that's when my stomach did that slow, sinking thing like an elevator with a bad cable. He asked me to come in and make a statement, and I did, and I told him everything, and he listened, and he wrote it down, and then he showed me an old photo of the property, and in it was the same house I'd walked up to, only the roof was collapsed and the windows were black and empty, and the porch sagged in a way it hadn't the night before. He told me no one lived there, that no utilities ran to that land anymore, and that the road I'd turned onto didn't even show up on their current maps, and I told him my GPS had taken me there, and he said that was interesting and wrote something else down. A week later, curiosity got the better of me, and I drove back out there in the middle of the day, and when I reached the turn, there was no road, just tall grass and a ditch and a fence line, and beyond it, nothing but a blackened foundation and a scatter of old boards like bones in a field, and no porch and no door, and no sign that anyone had been standing there less than 10 hours before. I stood there for a long time, trying to line up what I remembered with what I was seeing, and the only thing that matched was the shape of the hill behind it. And as I was turning to leave, my phone buzzed with a notification from the app, and for a second my heart actually jumped, because part of me expected to see her name again. But instead it was just a generic alert about a missed opportunity, and beneath it, a smaller line of text that said, "Customer feedback received." And when I opened it, there was no rating, no comment, just a timestamp from 11:49 p.m. and a single word that made my skin go cold, which was late. They found my car 2 days later, parked neatly at a rest stop I swear I never reached, with the engine cold, the doors locked, and the back seat empty. And the only thing inside that didn't belong to me was a single receipt from a gas station 3 counties away, printed at a time when I was already supposed to be home. I started driving nights because they paid better and asked fewer questions. At my age, that matters more than comfort. I wasn't doing food that year. I was doing rides. Airport runs, late shifts, people who didn't want to think about parking. Most nights blurred together into the same quiet loop of headlights and radio static and short conversations that ended with "have a good one." The request came in just after midnight. No name, just an initial. Pickup point was a closed medical office on the edge of town. Drop-off was listed as a small city almost an hour away. The pay was good enough that I didn't hesitate. The building was dark when I pulled up. Only one light burned above the side entrance, the kind that makes everything under it look tired and pale. I waited with the engine running, watching my own reflection in the windshield, and told myself I'd cancel if no one showed in a minute. Someone did. He came out of the shadows instead of the door. Tall, thin, wearing a jacket that looked too light for the night air. He didn't wave, didn't check his phone, just opened the back door and got in. "Evening," I said automatically. He didn't answer. That wasn't unusual. Some people don't want to talk. Some people are tired. Some people are angry at their own lives and take it out on silence. I pulled away from the curb and followed the route the app gave me. For the first 10 minutes, the only sound in the car was the tires on asphalt and the low hum of the engine. I glanced at the mirror a few times. He was sitting very still, looking straight ahead. Not at me, not at his phone, not out the window. "You headed to the city, or?" I started. Nothing. I let it go. Halfway through the trip, the app rerouted. Not unusual either. Traffic, construction, accidents. I took the new exit and felt the road change from smooth to rough under the tires. The city lights faded in the mirrors. The new route ran along a stretch of highway that cut through low woods and empty fields. The kind of road that looks the same no matter where you are. Straight, dark, quiet. I checked the time. 12:43 a.m. I checked the mirror again. He hadn't moved. "Everything okay back there?" I asked. He nodded once. Just once. That should have been the end of it. A normal, slightly awkward ride. But the app kept adjusting the route. Small changes at first. Turn here. A side road there. Each one adding a few minutes. Each one pulling us farther away from where we were supposed to be going. I slowed at a red light in a town I didn't recognize. The streets were empty. The storefronts dark. The kind of place that feels like it goes to sleep early and stays that way. The light turned green. I didn't move right away. I think the GPS is acting up, I said, mostly to fill the silence. It keeps sending me around. This time he spoke. Just keep driving. His voice was calm, flat, like he was reading something off a page in his head. Sir, it's taking us pretty far off the main. Just keep driving, he said again, a little firmer. I should have pulled over. I know that now. I should have ended the ride, told him to get out, called it in, done something other than keep going. Instead, I did what he said. The road narrowed. The trees crept closer to the shoulder. My headlights stopped catching reflective signs as often. When they did, they pointed to towns I'd never heard of. I checked the drop-off address again. It was still there. Still the same. Still supposedly in the city. But the route line on the map didn't seem to agree with it anymore. You sure this is the right way? I asked. He didn't answer. I looked in the mirror. He was looking at me now. Not angry. Not threatening. Just focused. The kind of look you get from someone who's waiting for something to happen. The app suddenly chimed and told me I had arrived. We were in the middle of nowhere. No house. No lights. No buildings. Just a wide gravel turnout and a line of trees beyond it. This can't be right, I said, slowing. There's nothing here. Stop here, he said. I pulled over, heart beating faster than it should have for such a small thing. He didn't get out. We sat there with the engine idling and the night pressing in around the car. You can let me out now, he said. I put the car in park. He still didn't move. Sir. Wait, he said. That's when I noticed the other car. No headlights at first. Just a shape easing out from the tree line behind us. Then the lights came on, washing over my rearview mirror and filling the inside of my car with white glare. My passenger finally reached for the door handle. Don't, I said without thinking. He paused, then looked at me again. Too late, he said. He got out. The other car stopped behind me. I didn't wait to see who was inside. I threw the car into drive and hit the gas. For a second, I thought he'd been dragged or knocked down because he wasn't in the mirror anymore. Then I saw him standing in the road, watching me go, not chasing, not shouting, just standing there like he'd been waiting for a bus that finally came. I didn't slow down until I saw the lights of a gas station a few miles later. I pulled in, hands shaking, and sat there with the engine running, staring at my own reflection again. The app showed the ride as completed. No payment. No passenger name. No route history. When I checked the back seat, there was nothing there, except a crumpled receipt on the floor. From a gas station 3 counties away, with a timestamp from 2 hours in the future. The police found my car 2 days later at that same station, parked straight between the lines like someone had taken their time with it, and they asked me how I got home, and I didn't have an answer that made sense, because the last thing I remember clearly is driving away from a man who never raised his voice, never touched me, and still somehow made sure I never finished that ride. The map said I was 20 minutes from home, but the gas station clerk told me the nearest town was over 2 hours away, and the look on his face made it clear he wasn't joking. I had been driving the same route for almost 15 years, the kind of back highway you learn so well you stop thinking about it, and that night I only took it because the main road was closed for construction and every detour sign pointed me in that direction like it always had, so there was nothing about the first hour that felt wrong. Not until I started noticing that the mile markers were counting down instead of up. At first I told myself I just missed something, because you don't question numbers on the side of the road, you just accept them. But when I passed mile marker 17 3 times in the space of 10 minutes, I slowed down and checked my odometer and felt that small, creeping unease that starts in your chest and spreads into your arms. The radio faded in and out as the road cut through low hills and trees, and every sign I passed told me I was getting closer to places I knew, but the landscape didn't agree with them anymore. And that was the part that started to bother me because I could recognize the names but not the turns, and I could follow the arrows but not the memories. I pulled over once to get my bearings and realized I didn't have any cell signal at all. Not even the weak kind that lets you pretend help is close, and when I got back on the road I promised myself I'd stop at the next place that looked even slightly familiar, but nothing did. The signs kept reassuring me, though, pointing me toward towns I had grown up near, telling me I was 15 miles out, then 12, then 10, and yet the mile markers kept repeating like someone had reset them while I wasn't looking, and when I finally saw headlights coming toward me, I felt an actual wave of relief because it meant I wasn't alone out there. But as the car passed, the driver didn't look at me, and I realized I hadn't seen a single other person's face in over an hour. The road narrowed without warning, the lines on the asphalt growing faint, and the trees moved closer like they were trying to listen. And then I came to an intersection that shouldn't have been there, because the sign said I could either turn left to get to the town I had left 2 hours ago or right to get to the town I was supposedly still driving toward, and both distances were listed as the same number of miles. I sat there with my blinker ticking, staring at those signs like they were part of a joke I didn't understand, and in the end I picked the right turn, because at least that one matched the direction I'd been going. 10 minutes later, I passed the same intersection again, and this time I knew for sure I hadn't turned around. My hands started to sweat on the wheel, and I caught myself checking the rearview mirror like I expected something to be following me, even though the road behind was as empty as the one ahead. The signs kept changing, too, not the names, but the distances, like they were adjusting to something I couldn't see, and when I passed a sign that told me I was 5 miles from home, I laughed out loud because I knew that couldn't be right, and then my headlights caught a familiar gas station sign in the distance and my stomach dropped, because it was the same one I had stopped at over an hour ago. I pulled in, more confused than scared, and went inside to ask the clerk what road I was on, and he looked at me like I'd asked him what year it was, and he said, "You're on County 12. And I told him that couldn't be right, because County 12 doesn't run anywhere near here, and he shrugged and said, "It does tonight." Like that explained anything at all. I asked him how to get back to the highway, and he pointed me out the door and said, "Follow the signs." And I almost laughed again, because that was exactly what I'd been doing. When I got back in my car, my dashboard clock said it was 1:10 a.m., even though I knew I'd left work before midnight, and when I drove out of the lot and back onto the road, the first sign I saw told me I was 20 minutes from home, and for a second I actually felt hope, until I noticed the mile marker beside it said 17. I drove for what felt like another hour, watching the same numbers repeat, the same names come and go, the same curves in the road return like I was stuck on a track that only pretended to move forward, and the worst part was that nothing dramatic ever happened. No crash, no figure in the road, no sudden moment I could point to and say, "That's where it broke." Just a slow, quiet certainty that I wasn't getting anywhere anymore. I don't remember deciding to turn around, but at some point I did, and the road behind me looked exactly like the road ahead, and the signs were just as confident about where they were sending me. The next thing I remember clearly is pulling into my own driveway with the sky just starting to lighten, my head pounding and my eyes burning like I hadn't slept in days, and when I went inside and checked the clock, it was 6:30 a.m., which meant I'd been on a road that should take 40 minutes for over 6 hours. A week later, I drove that same route in the middle of the day and it was completely normal. The signs matched the towns, the mile markers counted the right way, and I got home in exactly the time I always had. But every now and then, when I pass one of those green signs at night, I catch myself checking the number twice, because part of me is still afraid that if I'm not careful, I'll take the same turn again and spend another night driving through a place that knows exactly where it wants to send you, even if it never plans to let you arrive. The operator kept asking me what county I was in, and I kept telling her I didn't know, because the sign at the edge of town had been knocked over and the name of the place wasn't showing up on my phone at all. And that was when the call went silent even though I could still hear my own breathing. I had only stopped there because the van was running hot and the temperature needle was creeping up into a part of the gauge I didn't like, and the town had appeared out of nowhere on a stretch of road that normally only had trees and old farm fences, just a handful of buildings clustered around a single four-way intersection like they were holding on to each other for support. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was, not peaceful quiet, but the kind where even your own footsteps sound like they don't belong. And the second thing I noticed was that every storefront window was dark even though it was only a little after 9 in the evening. I pulled into a small lot next to what looked like a closed diner and let the engine idle, hoping it would cool down enough for me to keep going. And that's when I saw someone standing under a streetlight across the road, not waving, not moving, just waiting, and I told myself it was none of my business and went back to watching the temperature gauge. The needle didn't move, and neither did the person, and after a minute I shut the engine off and got out, more annoyed than scared, and walked toward the diner to see if anyone was inside, because even a dead town usually has one person who didn't get the memo. The door was locked, the windows were dusty, and there was a handwritten sign taped inside that just said closed with no date and no explanation. And when I turned back toward my van, the person under the streetlight was gone. I felt that familiar, uncomfortable tightening in my chest, the kind you get when something small changes without asking your permission, and I took my phone out and tried to check my signal, and that's when I realized I didn't have any, not even enough to fake a bar. I walked back to the van and tried the engine again, and it turned over, coughed, and died, and that was the moment when the situation stopped feeling like an inconvenience and started feeling like a problem. I dialed 911 anyway, because sometimes you get lucky, and when the call went through, I felt a rush of relief that disappeared as soon as the operator asked me where I was, and I couldn't give her an answer that meant anything to either of us. I told her the road number, I told her about the intersection, I told her about the diner, and she kept typing and then pausing and then typing again, and finally she said, "Sir, that location isn't coming up in our system." And I said, "Well, I'm standing in it." And that's when the line went quiet in a way that wasn't the same as being disconnected, because I could still hear the faint hum of the call, but she wasn't there anymore. I said hello a few times and nothing answered, and when I pulled the phone away from my ear, the call timer was still counting up like everything was normal. I hung up and tried again, and this time it didn't even ring. It just went straight to a dead tone like I dialed a number that didn't exist. I told myself to calm down and went to get my flashlight from the van, and when I turned it on and swept it across the street, it caught the edges of buildings that looked more like outlines than real structures, like they were props someone had forgotten to take down. I walked to the nearest one, a small hardware store with its name faded almost completely off the sign, and tried the door, and it opened, and that scared me more than if it had been locked. Inside, the shelves were mostly empty, and the ones that weren't held items covered in dust like they'd been sitting there for years, and the air smelled stale, like nothing had moved through it in a long time. I called out, and my voice came back to me in a thin echo that made the place feel bigger than it should have been, and that's when I heard footsteps somewhere behind the counter. I froze, listening, and then a man stepped out into the light of my flashlight, and he looked normal in the way that makes you instantly suspicious, like he'd been chosen out of a catalog of generic townspeople. And he asked me if I was passing through. I told him my van had overheated and asked if there was a mechanic or a tow service nearby, and he smiled in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes and said, "Phones don't really work here." And I asked him what he meant, and he said, "They work, but they don't go anywhere." I asked him if he could call someone for me, and he shook his head and said, "We don't do that anymore." And when I asked who we were, he looked past me toward the door like he was checking the street and said, "People who stay." That was when I realized the shelves behind him weren't just dusty. They were organized, like someone still cared enough to keep things in order even if no one was buying them, and that thought bothered me more than the emptiness. I thanked him and backed out of the store, and as soon as I was outside, I tried my phone again, and for a second it showed a full signal and my heart jumped, and then every bar vanished at once like someone had flipped a switch. When I looked up, I saw two more people standing at the far end of the street, both of them facing my van, both of them standing under lights that buzzed softly like insects. I walked faster without meaning to, and when I reached the van, the temperature needle hadn't moved at all, like the engine had frozen in time. I tried the ignition again, and this time it started, rough but running, and I didn't question it, I just got in and put it in gear. As I pulled away, I glanced in the mirror and saw the man from the store step out onto the sidewalk, and he raised his hand, not to wave, but like he was signaling something behind me, and for a second I thought I saw more people moving in the dark between the buildings, but I didn't slow down to check. The road out of town looked the same as the road in, and that should have been comforting, but it wasn't because my GPS still showed nothing, and my phone still couldn't tell me where I was. It wasn't until I'd been driving for almost 20 minutes that my signal came back, and the first thing that happened wasn't a missed call or a message. It was a notification from my phone telling me I had tried to contact emergency services from an unsupported location. I never saw that town again, even though I drove that route dozens of times afterward, and when I asked around, no one seemed to know what I was talking about, and the only proof I have that I didn't imagine it is a call log on my phone that shows a 911 call that lasted 6 minutes and 32 seconds, with no record of where it was made from and no record of who, if anyone, was on the other end. He thanked me for returning his wallet, then asked how my wife's knee was doing, and that was the exact moment I understood I had never dropped a wallet at all. I had only stopped at that rest area because my eyes were starting to blur and the lines on the road were doing that slow swimming thing that tells you it's time to pull over, and the place was almost empty, just a row of dark cars, a humming soda machine, and a bathroom that smelled like disinfectant and old tile. I remember seeing the wallet on the ground near the entrance and thinking someone was going to have a bad night if they didn't get it back. So I picked it up, flipped it open just enough to see a driver's license inside, and walked back out looking for the owner. The man was leaning against a gray sedan I didn't remember seeing when I pulled in, and he smiled like we were already in the middle of a conversation and said, "I was wondering how long it would take you," which struck me as a strange way to thank someone for not stealing your money. I handed him the wallet and he took it, and then he said my name, not as a question, not checking, just saying it like he'd been using it all day. I felt that small, cold drop in my stomach and asked him how he knew it, and he said, "You left it on the table this morning," and then laughed like he'd made a joke I was supposed to remember. I told him he had me confused with someone else, and he tilted his head and said, "No, I don't think I do." And then, still smiling, he asked me if my wife's knee was any better after the fall, and I remember the exact way the air seemed to get heavier around us, because I hadn't told anyone at work about that, and I hadn't told anyone on the road about that, and the only people who knew were me, my wife, and the doctor who'd looked at the X-ray. I told him he should stop guessing and start explaining, and he said, "It's not guessing, it's paying attention." And then he asked me if I was still thinking about retiring at the end of the year, or if the hours had convinced me to push it back again. That was when I started to look around the parking lot, not for help, but for something that would make this make sense, and there was nothing, just the same empty cars and the same quiet and the same soda machine humming like it didn't care about any of this. I asked him who he was, and he said, "Someone who's been on the same roads as you for a long time," and I told him I didn't know him, and he said, "You've seen me." And when I said where, he said, "In mirrors mostly," which would have sounded like a threat if he hadn't said it so casually. I took a step back and told him I was leaving, and he nodded like that was part of the plan and said, "You always do." And then, before I could stop him, he asked me if I still kept the spare key in the coffee can in the garage, or if I'd finally moved it after the break-in down the street last winter. I didn't answer, because my mouth had gone dry and my brain was trying to catch up to my ears, and he filled the silence by saying, "You should move it, by the way," like he was giving me friendly advice. I asked him if he'd been following me, and he shrugged and said, "Not like you're thinking." And then he looked past me at my car and said, "You're parked a little crooked. You know, you always do that when you're tired." And that was too specific, too small, too real, and it made my skin crawl more than if he just threatened me outright. I told him to stay away from me and my family, and he raised his hands in a peaceful gesture and said, "I already do." And then he paused and added, "Most of the time." He walked around to his car, opened the door, and before getting in, he said, "Tell her I hope the knee heals before the weather turns." And then he drove away, slow and unhurried, like there was nowhere else he needed to be. I stood there longer than I should have, then got in my own car and drove home with my eyes on every reflection in every window, and when I pulled into my driveway, the garage light was on, even though I was sure I'd turned it off when I left. Inside, everything looked normal, but I still walked through every room, checking corners and doors like I'd forgotten how my own house worked, and when I finally sat down, I told myself it was probably some kind of coincidence layered on top of another coincidence, and that my brain had done the rest because it was tired and looking for patterns. 2 days later, I found the coffee can empty. The spare key was gone. Nothing else was missing, nothing else was touched, and there were no signs of anyone forcing their way in, and when I checked the cameras I'd installed after that, there was a gap in the footage right around 3 in the morning, just a clean, quiet hour where nothing had been recorded at all, like the system had blinked and missed something important. I never saw the man again, but every now and then, when I catch my reflection in a dark window or a side mirror, I get the uncomfortable feeling that I'm not just looking at myself, and that somewhere, someone who already knows my name is checking to see if I finally moved the key. The receipt printer wouldn't stop screaming, and every time I tore one off and crumpled it, the same order came back with the same address, the same total, and the same note that said, "Please don't leave it this time." I wasn't even supposed to be working that night, but my manager had called in a favor because 2 drivers had quit in the same week and the schedule had holes in it like it had been chewed on, so I said yes and told myself I'd do a few runs and go home. The place was quiet in that late evening way where the kitchen noise sounds louder than it should and every customer feels like the last one you'll see, and the first time the order printed, no one thought anything of it because it was a simple one, just a small bag, a normal address, and a note that looked like it had been typed by someone who didn't trust drop-off photos. I took it, drove it, and when I got to the house, there was nothing unusual about it. Just a single-story place with a porch light on and a car in the driveway. And I knocked and waited, and then left it when no one answered, took the picture, and drove back. By the time I pulled into the lot, the same order was printing again, And the cashier laughed and said, "Guess they didn't get it?" And I told him I'd just been there, and he shrugged and said, "Maybe they messed up the app." And I took it again because it was on my way and I didn't feel like arguing with something that simple. The second time, the porch light was off, the car was gone, and the house felt emptier, like someone had taken a layer of it away while I wasn't looking. And when I knocked, no sound came from inside at all, not even the muffled kind you get from TVs or air conditioners, so I left the bag, took the photo, and drove back again. The third time, the manager noticed, because the printer had barely stopped before it started again, and he frowned at the screen and said, "It's the same one." And I said, "I know." And he tried to cancel it, and the system wouldn't let him. And that was when the note changed from, "Please don't leave it this time," to "Please bring it inside." We stood there looking at each other like the computer had just cleared its throat, and he said, "I'm not sending anyone back there." And I said, "You don't have to." And then the printer started again, and the order came back with my name on it. Not in the customer field, but in the driver field, like it had already decided. I don't know why I took it, and I don't want to pretend it was bravery because it wasn't. It was more like that tired, irritated part of your brain that just wants something to stop making noise. The drive felt longer that time, even though the route was the same, and the radio cut in and out like it couldn't decide what station existed. And when I turned onto the street, half the houses were dark in a way they hadn't been before, like the block had decided to go to sleep early. The address was still there, but the porch light wasn't, and the windows were dark, and the front door was open just a few inches. And I sat in my car for a full minute telling myself that this was stupid and that I should turn around. And then my phone buzzed with a message from the order that just said, "You're here." I got out because at that point I wanted it over with more than I wanted to be safe. And when I pushed the door open, the house smelled cold, not like rot or dust, just like air that hadn't been moved around in a while. The hallway was empty, the living room was empty, and there was a small table just inside with 2 other delivery bags sitting on it, both with the same logo as mine, both looking older than they should have been, like they'd been there longer than tonight. I set mine down next to them and said hello, and my voice didn't go very far, and my phone buzzed again and said, "Further." And I felt my shoulders tighten like I just heard someone behind me even though I hadn't. I took 2 steps into the house and stopped, because the floor creaked in a way that sounded like it was answering something, and I realized there were footprints in the dust that didn't match mine, going from the front door toward the back and then stopping like whoever made them had simply decided not to come back. I said I was leaving it there, took a picture of the bags on the table, and turned around, and that's when my phone buzzed again and said, "Not there." And for a second I had the stupid thought that maybe if I just followed the instructions, this would finally be over. I didn't go any farther. I don't remember deciding that. I just remember my body doing it for me, backing out of the house, closing the door, and walking to my car with my heart beating too fast for the distance I'd moved. When I got back to the restaurant, the order was already printing again, and this time the note said, "You forgot something," and my name was still in the driver field, and my manager told me he was calling corporate, and I told him to do it, and then the screen blinked and the order disappeared like it had never been there. We stood in that quiet for a few seconds, and then another normal order came in, and the night went back to pretending it was ordinary. I went home and tried to sleep, and every time I closed my eyes I saw that little table with the bags lined up like someone had been keeping count. A week later I got a notification from the app while I was at the grocery store, and it wasn't an order, it was a memory. One of those useless little features that shows you something you did before, and it was a photo I didn't remember taking of 3 delivery bags on a small table in a dark hallway, and beneath it, in the same plain system font as everything else, was a caption that just said, "Almost." I deleted the app that day, but every now and then, when I'm in a quiet room and I hear a printer start up somewhere, my first thought isn't about paper or ink anymore. It's about an order that learned my name and didn't like being told no. The report was already waiting for me when I got to the office, filled out in my name, time-stamped for a night I hadn't worked, and closed with a resolution I knew wasn't true. I didn't even notice it at first because after 20 years of night driving you stop being surprised by paperwork that doesn't quite match your memory. But when I saw the address listed under incident location, my stomach tightened because it wasn't a street and it wasn't a town, it was a string of coordinates that looked exactly like the ones I'd seen on a delivery screen months earlier, back when I was still telling myself those stories were just coincidences. I worked for a small logistics company then, the kind that handles late transfers and odd routes no one else wants, and my job had quietly turned into less about driving and more about documenting things that went wrong on the road, which meant I spent my nights reading reports from people who all sounded a little too much like me, people who described roads that didn't match signs, towns that didn't show up on maps, calls that went nowhere, and systems that insisted everything was fine right. Up until it wasn't. The company line was simple: human error, outdated data, stress, fatigue. But after a while you start to notice patterns even when you don't want to, like how many of the reports mentioned the same stretches of highway, or how often the timestamps clustered around the same quiet hours when most of the country is asleep and not paying attention. The file on my desk that night was marked closed, no action required. And that alone was strange, because anything involving coordinates instead of an address usually got bounced back for clarification. But this one had gone straight through, signed off, and archived, and when I opened it, I found a familiar kind of story inside. A driver who had followed the route exactly as given, who had ended up somewhere that didn't match the description, who had tried to call for help and failed, and who had eventually made it home with a timeline that didn't add up. The name on the report wasn't mine, but the car model was, and the dashcam still image attached to it showed a pair of headlights pointed at a dark stretch of road that I recognized, even though I couldn't have said from where. I checked the date again, then checked my own schedule and saw that I'd been off that night, or at least that's what the system said, and that was the first time I felt that old, familiar unease creep back in, the feeling that something had been filed away under my name without asking me first. I walked down the hall to ask about it, and the supervisor on duty barely looked up from his screen when I mentioned the report, just told me it was already handled and that I should let it go. And when I asked how a report could be handled if the driver listed had never come in, he said, "The system reconciles discrepancies." Like that was an answer and not a way of ending a conversation. I didn't let it go. I pulled up the internal map the company used, the one that overlaid routes, incidents, and delays, and I searched the coordinates from the report, and what came up wasn't a point on a road, it was a small gray patch labeled Data Incomplete, sitting in the middle of an area that should have been full of details. I zoomed out and saw 3 more of those patches, then 5, then more, scattered along different routes like stains that wouldn't wash out, and when I clicked on one at random, it brought up another closed report with another driver's name and another story that ended with the same quiet, confident resolution. No action required. That was when I started cross-checking dates, times, and vehicle IDs, and that was when I realized some of those reports lined up with nights I remembered driving, nights I remembered getting home late and tired without being able to explain why, nights where my own dashcam had gaps I'd blamed on glitches. I sat there longer than I should have, watching the pattern take shape, and the simplest version of it was this. The system didn't just record routes, it corrected them, and sometimes that correction meant writing over a person's memory instead of the data. I printed the report and took it home, because I didn't trust the network anymore, and that alone felt like a small act of rebellion, like stepping off a marked path in the woods to see if anything would notice. On the drive, my phone buzzed with a notification from the company app, a polite reminder that I had an unsubmitted incident report and that timely documentation improved overall efficiency. And for a second I almost laughed, because the timing was too neat to be a coincidence. When I got home, I pulled out my old logbooks, the paper ones I'd kept before everything went digital, and I started lining up dates with the reports I'd found, and the more I looked, the more I saw small, quiet mismatches, hours that didn't quite add up, routes that took longer than they should have, notes in my own handwriting that didn't explain anything but did suggest I'd been more tired than usual. Around 2 in the morning, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a calm, recorded voice thanked me for my cooperation and told me that the incident I was reviewing had already been resolved and that no further action was required. And when I asked who I was speaking to, the voice said, "Route optimization," like it was introducing itself. I hung up, but my phone didn't show a call in the log afterward, and that was the moment I understood that whatever I was dealing with didn't care about being seen, only about being followed. The next day, the printed report was gone from my kitchen table, and in its place was a note on company letterhead reminding me about data handling policies. And when I checked the office system, the file I'd seen before was still there, still closed, still neat, and now it listed me as the reviewing officer, even though I hadn't touched it. I told myself I'd imagine the rest, that stress does strange things to people who work too long at night, but that explanation got harder to hold on to when I started noticing the detour signs on my drive home changing more often, or when my GPS suggested routes that shaved off minutes in ways that didn't make sense, or when a coworker mentioned losing an hour on a run and laughed it off because the delivery still showed as on time. The system, whatever it was, didn't need to scare anyone because it wasn't trying to hurt people, it was trying to make things fit, and sometimes people were the part that didn't. I filed a new report anyway, not in the company system, but in a notebook I kept in my glove box, and I wrote down everything I could remember, every night that felt too long, every road that didn't line up, every gap that had been smoothed over by a green checkmark, and I told myself that as long as I kept a record, at least one version of the truth would exist somewhere. A week later, I found a summary of my notes in my work inbox, formatted, corrected, and marked reviewed, with a short comment at the bottom thanking me for helping improve route efficiency and reminding me, again, that no further action was required. I still drive sometimes, but I don't follow suggested routes without thinking anymore, and I keep paper maps in the car like it's 1995, and every now and then, late at night, when the road is empty and the signs all agree a little too easily, I get the feeling that something is watching to see if I'll make the easy choice, because the system doesn't need you to disappear to work, it just needs you to arrive exactly where it says you did, even if you don't remember the trip the same way.